You shall go to that man instead of my daughter. To cover the shame of a noble house, far worse deeds must be done. Margaret, I beg of you, I am terrified of that beast of a man. Cold water from a winter well seemed to freeze the blood on her hands as the marriage contract was thrown to the stone floor. Before she could even beg for mercy, the manor servants rushed upon her. They forced a heavy wool dress over her head, as roughly as one might skin a beast. Even the gasp escaping her lips was choked off by the tight leather belt they strapped around her waist. The heavy wooden door of the carriage slammed shut, sounding exactly like the lid of a coffin being nailed down. Soon, the carriage rattled through the muddy market square. Amidst the pouring rain of pointing fingers and cruel jeers, the name Elara was entirely erased. Would you turn a blind eye to such bitter injustice? Will you stand by her side and offer your favor to support her? The wooden carriage came to a halt, and the rough, heavy breathing of a strange man could be heard from beyond the door. When the door opened, would a true monster be waiting to claim her? Inside the timber cottage, a winter draft flickered the candlelight, stretching the man's shadow across the stone wall in a grotesque, towering shape. The husband they called a beast, Bram, said nothing at first. He reached into his heavy cloak and pulled out a small, silver-inlaid oak casket, setting it upon the oak table. In the brief moment the lid was lifted, a heavy silver seal bearing a royal crest and a dark parchment gleamed under the pale light. It was a precious, lordly thing, completely out of place in what was rumored to be an outlaw's den. As if fearing unseen eyes, Bram quickly shoved the items deep inside, locked the casket with a heavy iron padlock, and cast a sharp, piercing glare toward the door. Elara curled her body into the deepest, darkest corner of the room. She felt as though a brutal hand would grab her by the hair at any second, and she hardly dared to draw a breath. Bram rose from his wooden chair and took a long stride toward her. Elara squeezed her eyes shut, bracing herself for the pain that was sure to follow. A dull thud echoed, followed immediately by a rich, savory scent that filled her nose. When she opened her eyes just a sliver, a steaming wooden bowl of thick barley and meat stew sat before her. A rough hand carelessly tossed a clean white linen cloth into her lap. His knuckles were thick and scarred, but they were not the wicked, murderous hands the village gossip had claimed. Rather, those calloused palms seemed as solid and warm as sun-baked stone. Eat. If you starve and collapse, it will ruin my good name. The words were thrown at her like a scolding, yet beneath the gruff tone lay a strange, unexpected warmth. You are my people now. That single phrase lingered in her ears, not as a threat, but as a binding promise. In a place where she thought she had been sent to die, it was the first time she had ever been treated as a human being. The tight, agonizing string of tension snapped inside her. Elara raised the wooden bowl with trembling hands and swallowed a mouthful. As the hot broth traveled down her throat, the bitter sorrow she had been holding back finally burst forth, and heavy tears dripped down into her stew. Instead of trying to hush the weeping girl, Bram silently reached over and trimmed the candle wick, dimming the light. Leaving the warmest spot near the hearth for her, he took the cold corner of the room, turned his back to her, and soon began to snore. Just as a wave of relief washed over her, A shadow slipped past the gap in the wooden shutters. The heavy tension returned, suffocating the room. Someone was watching this house. What in the world was inside that locked casket? Stolen gold? As soon as dawn broke, Bram reached deep into the heavy oak wardrobe and pulled out fresh garments. It was a fine linen gown and a beautifully woven wool cloak. His rough hands were clumsy as he helped her tie the laces, his expression completely indifferent. Yet the tips of his fingers brushing against her collar were incredibly careful. Gathering the few servants in the courtyard, he barked a loud command. From this day forth, you will serve her as the mistress of this house. If I see any disrespect, you will answer to my fists. For her entire life, she had been called nothing but a wench or a maid. Hearing the title of mistress for the first time in her life made Elara grip the fabric of her gown tightly. The muddy market square they walked through was bustling with life, but the moment Bram appeared, the very air seemed to shift. Rough mercenaries and loud merchants stopped what they were doing and bowed their heads. Yet, instead of throwing his weight around, Bram paid fair silver pennies to the grain merchants and nodded respectfully in return. Contrary to the rumors that called him a demon, he was a man who kept his own strict code of honor. Then it happened. A sharp scream pierced through the noisy crowd. A drunken ruffian was kicking a woven basket belonging to an old woman who was cowering on the ground. Agnes watched in despair as her winter cabbages and root vegetables were trampled into the filthy mud. Bram's eyes hardened fiercely. He adjusted his grip on his heavy oak walking stick. The sound of the wood cutting through the air was terrifyingly sharp. The solid tip of the stick struck the ruffian squarely in the chest. It was a single, devastating blow. The massive thug crumpled to the dirt like a falling autumn leaf, unable to even scream. A deathly silence poured over the once loud market square, like cold water on a fire. I will not watch the common folk be tormented in my territory. Get out of my sight. A cold, murderous intent swirled in Bram's eyes as he looked down at the ruffian groveling in the mud. Elara instinctively knew this man was no simple street thug. He was definitely hiding something. But where the light is strong, the shadow is always deep. Whispers drifted from the corner of the alleyway. Isn't that the lowborn maid from the old lord's estate? Looks like she changed her fate by spreading her legs for a bandit. Look at that lowborn trash wearing fine linen. It makes me want to spit. The words were like daggers carving into her chest. Overcome with shame, Elara bowed her head like a condemned sinner. Suddenly, a strong hand snatched hers. Making sure everyone could see, Bram intertwined his fingers with hers and walked forward with absolute pride. A burning warmth transferred from his calloused palm to hers. Her trembling stopped, but a dark shadow of anxiety still lingered in a corner of her heart. How long could this fragile peace possibly last? Happiness was brief, and the shadows grew longer. A few days later, the couple was walking along the riverbank. They looked peaceful on the outside, but Bram's eyes were as sharp as a hawk in a hunting ground. He carefully observed the wooden barges docked at the pier. Between the laborers carrying heavy sacks of salt, suspicious glances and secret hand signals were being exchanged. Amidst the smell of the river water, the
The cold scent of iron weapons drifted on the wind.
It was on their way back up the castle road. A man in brown clothes, Giles, purposely bumped hard into Elara's shoulder as he passed.
Before Bram could even catch her as she stumbled, Giles bent down at the waist, pretending to pick up a dropped cloth.
However, his eyes were not on the cloth.
They were slithering like a snake, scanning the layout of the cottage and measuring the height of the stone wall. In the brief moment their eyes met, Elara saw a terrifying greed lurking in Giles's gaze. She instinctively pulled her cloak tighter and shivered. That man was no ordinary traveler. As the night deepened, the wind howled fiercely like a crying beast. Bram, who would normally be home by now, had not returned even past midnight. Elara went to the heavy oak wardrobe, pulled out the silver-inlaid casket from its hiding place, and held it tightly against her chest. What on earth was this casket that her husband protected it like his own life, and those men circled it like starving wolves? She stepped out onto the porch and paced anxiously. In the distance, the sound of dogs barking violently shattered the silence. A dark premonition ran down her spine like ice water. Elara ran to the wooden gate and checked the heavy iron latch twice. The firmly barred door was her only shield. Then it happened. A dark figure suddenly rose above the stone wall, peering into the courtyard. Her breath hitched in her throat. Sensing her presence, the shadow vanished into the darkness in an instant. What she had briefly glimpsed in the moonlight was the edge of the brown tunic worn by Giles, the man from the road. Unseen eyes were surrounding the house. The net had already been cast, and it was slowly pulling tight. With a loud creak, the front gate rattled. Hearing familiar footsteps, she ran out. Bram's heavy cloak was soaking wet with the night mist. "Why are you returning so late? The night air is freezing." Instead of answering, Bram glared at the top of the wall with chilling eyes. His hand brushed against the leather belt where a dagger would normally rest. Ah, the hounds have already caught the scent and reached the front door. Were they truly after her husband's life? Or were they after the dark oak casket she held so tightly against her chest? Before the morning fog could even lift from the village, urgent footsteps shattered the quiet of the courtyard. The latched door was thrown open roughly, and Bram burst in along with a gust of freezing wind. His cloak was completely covered in thick mud, and his heavy breathing carried the metallic stench of blood. He looked like a man who had spent the entire night running from a wild beast, yet his eyes were fiercely alive. Without giving her a moment to ask questions, he pulled the silver-inlaid casket from his coat. As if handling the most fragile relic in the world, he took a dry cloth with trembling hands and carefully wiped away the dirt smeared across the oak. Once the silver-inlaid casket regained its dark shine, he placed it into Elara's hands and looked her dead in the eye. The freezing chill of the casket touched her fingertips and pierced straight through her veins into her heart. "This is our life. Protect this casket before you protect me." His voice was low, but absolute. "No matter what happens, you must not let those men take this, especially the sheriff's men." At the mention of the sheriff, her heart plummeted to the floor. Why must they hide from the very lawmen meant to protect the realm? What in God's name was inside this casket?
Consumed by terror, Elara's hands began to shake violently, like a leaf in a storm. "What is happening? Please tell me." Instead of answering, Bram wrapped his large, rough, and warm hands tightly around her trembling ones. That fleeting warmth was his only comfort, and his farewell. Right then, the sound of murmuring voices began to echo from beyond the wall. The sound of dozens of heavy leather boots dragging against the dirt. The terrifying clatter of iron spears and swords surrounding the cottage. The hounds had caught the scent and finally arrived. Bram stood up and turned toward the door. He wore the grim, resolute expression of a man walking a path from which he might never return. Elara looked down at the casket resting on her lap. She felt its heavy, dreadful weight. This was no simple object. It was her husband's life, and the weight of the destiny she now had to carry. A howling wind blew in, threatening to tear the wooden shutters off their hinges, and extinguished the flickering candle. The room was instantly plunged into total darkness. Even in the pitch black, Bram's eyes gleamed like a beast's. That look was forcing a silent promise upon her. Survive. Protect it, no matter the cost. She bit her lip and nodded. Then she shoved the cold casket deep beneath the folds of her wool skirt, pressing it against her own flesh, the safest place she knew. A deafening blow smashed against the heavy wooden gate, shattering the quiet of the dawn. If the men breaking in were the sheriff's guards, should she truly follow her husband's words and distrust the crown's own law? If she could not even trust the law, who in this world could she trust? With a sickening crack of splintering wood, the iron latch broke and the gate was thrown wide open. Tearing through the pale blue darkness of the early morning were men covered in mud and hardened leather armor. The guards, gripping heavy wooden clubs and iron-tipped spears, marched heavily onto the porch. Yesterday, Bram had spent hours carefully scrubbing those very floorboards, and now filthy mud prints were stamped across them like ugly scars. This was no simple intrusion. It was a ruthless trampling of the tiny, fragile world they had barely managed to build together. The door was ripped open, and the freezing wind swallowed whatever warmth remained in the room. Bram did not try to run. He held out both of his arms, as if he had anticipated this exact moment. Thick, rough hemp ropes bit into his thick wrists, binding him tightly. His powerful muscles twitched, but he did not resist. Seeing him surrender so peacefully, he did not look like a wild beast, but rather a man who had chosen to bear the weight of all sins in absolute silence. "Drag that thieving smuggler out here right now! He's been stealing the king's goods!" The captain's roar was loud enough to split their eardrums. The village people, who had gathered over the walls to watch, began to mutter. "Smuggling? Lord have mercy!" They always said you shouldn't take in a stray beast. These were the very same people who had bowed respectfully to him just yesterday. Their curious eyes instantly turned into glares of contempt and mockery, flying at him like daggers. The captain stepped into the room, his eyes flashing with malice. His greedy gaze swept over the oak wardrobe and the wooden chests. Was he truly here to punish a crime? The captain's eyes scanned the room like a starving wolf hunting for costly spoils. His gaze soon fell upon Elara, who was huddled in the corner, and then drifted toward the folds of her wool dress, where she was desperately hiding something. In that fleeting moment, Bram, bound tight with rough hemp rope, twisted his body violently to block the captain's path. The manor guards shoved down hard on his shoulders, but his back, as solid as a stone church wall, did not yield an inch. Bram's gaze pierced right through Elara's eyes. His mouth was shut tight, but his eyes were screaming. "Do not look at me. Remember the casket." It was a silent, desperate cry, staking his very life. Overwhelmed by that fierce, chilling intensity, Elara backed away until her shoulders hit the timber wall. The cold, silver-inlaid casket, pressed deep against her thigh beneath her skirts, felt as searing hot as a hearth fire. She was so consumed by terror, she could not even draw a breath. The guards dragged Bram roughly out into the muddy yard. "The beast cannot change his nature. Acting like a nobleman, and look at him now." The villagers' pointing fingers rained down on him like a winter storm. The sound of spitting, foul curses, and cruel mockery mixed into absolute chaos. Bram was dragged away without looking back even once. In the center of the dirt-kicked yard, only one of his worn leather shoes, torn off as he was hauled away, lay abandoned. Someone's spit landed on the masterless shoe. The wake left by the guards was no different from a ruined village after a bandit raid. The broken wooden door rattled, letting the cold wind howl through. Instead of collapsing to weep, Elara bit her lips so hard that the metallic taste of blood spread across her tongue. As she stared at that single leather shoe, the fear vanished from her eyes, replaced by a fierce, venomous resolve. Her husband was innocent. This was all a wicked trap. Forcing strength into her trembling legs, she dragged her unsteady body upright. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but her fists were clenched so tightly her knuckles turned bone white. They would return. She had to move the casket before they tore the cottage apart looking for it. The dirt road where Bram had been dragged was thick with swirling dust. She did not even take the time to put on her own shoes, bolting barefoot into the cold. Her heavy skirts tangled around her ankles, but she grabbed the cumbersome fabric as if to rip it away and kept running. The oak casket hidden against her chest beat against her ribs in time with her pounding heart. This was no simple cargo. It was her husband's life, the sole truth he had left behind. Her breath caught in her throat, her lungs burning as if they were tearing apart, but she could not stop. As she reached the entrance of the muddy market square, familiar faces blocked her path like a wall of stone. These were the very peasants who, just yesterday, had bowed and called her the mistress of the house. Now, their eyes were as vicious as wild hounds eyeing fresh meat. Someone deliberately stuck out a foot. Elara tripped and slammed into the muddy earth. Above her head, a shower of ridicule poured down. Look at the lowborn wench trying to save her beast of a husband. Where does an outlaw's wife think she is going? The sound of spitting struck her ears. Her knees were scraped raw, bright red blood flowing down to stain her linen gown. A stinging pain washed over her, but she bit her lip and staggered to her feet. She could not even spare a second to brush the mud from her bleeding dress. Facing the burly marketmen blocking her way, she screamed at the top of her lungs, "Step aside! My husband is an innocent man!" Her hollow cry was completely drowned out by their mocking laughter. She shoved past their shoulders, wedging herself through the gaps in the crowd, and sprinted toward the sheriff's court. Without a moment to wipe her face, smeared with sweat and tears, she ran, fixing her eyes only on the Lord's banners fluttering in the distance. When she finally arrived, the high stone walls of the courtyard loomed over her like a giant, merciless beast. Standing firm before the imposing, iron-studded gates was the gatekeeper, gripping a long iron spear. He leveled the cold, deadly tip of his spear right at her throat. "Where do you think you are going, wife of a criminal? Begone!" As the spear tip thrust closer, she stumbled backward. She could never overpower him with sheer strength. Thinking of the agony Bram must be suffering inside the walls, every passing second was a matter of life and death. With trembling hands, she reached deep into her bodice and pulled out a small pouch of silver coins. It was the coin Bram had given her to buy winter provisions. The gatekeeper's eyes flashed at the clinking sound of silver. His greedy gaze swept over her hands and her desperate face. Swallowing her pride, Elara pressed the silver coins into the guard's rough palm. In the brief moment that the cold metal changed hands, a silent, corrupt pact was made. The gatekeeper glanced around cautiously, then let a greasy, crooked smile slip across his lips. Should have done that in the first place. Go through the servants' gate in the back. The spear was withdrawn, and with a harsh creak, a narrow wooden side door opened. It was barely fit for a hound, but Elara squeezed her bruised body through it.
Humiliation choked her throat, but saving her husband had to come first.
From the center, where the whipping post stood, the phantom echoes of screams seemed to ring in her ears. She clutched the heavy casket against her chest even tighter. She had bribed a lowly guard with silver, but what would the High Lord sitting on the judgment seat demand? If a devil who could not be swayed by coin was waiting for her, what else could she possibly offer? The main courtyard was already suffocating, thick with the metallic stench of blood and the feverish heat of the gathered mob. Tied to the heavy oak whipping post, Bram's broad back was already torn and stained crimson from the brutal, unlawful strikes of the heavy wooden rod. Blood flowing from his split flesh dripped down, turning the dry dirt black. Yet he did not let out a single beastly groan. He just clamped his jaw shut and endured it. As the executioner raised the thick rod high into the air once more, a grotesque mixture of cruel cheers and pitying gasps erupted from the crowd. Standing right beside the sheriff's grand chair was Giles, the very same man who had been spying over their cottage fence days ago. He was looking down at the bloodied Bram, letting out a wicked, sniveling laugh like a scavenging rat. It was absolutely clear that all of this was his vile scheme. She could not delay another second. Elara forced her way through the mob, throwing her bare feet into the center of the muddy courtyard. Her feet, visible through her torn skirts, were bruised and cut from jagged stones, but she felt no pain. As the manor guards roughly blocked her path with their spears, she raised the bundle containing the casket high above her head. "Stop! The proof of this man's innocence is right here!" Her desperate, heart-wrenching scream echoed off the stone walls of the courtyard.
The heavy rod, about to strike, froze in midair.
The sheriff waved his hand like he was swatting a pesky fly, signaling the guards to step back. His brow furrowed fiercely as he bellowed, "How dare you interrupt a sacred court of law?"
"Do you wish to be tied to the post and whipped alongside him, wench?" Despite the deadly threat, Elara did not retreat. With trembling fingers, she began to untie the tight knot of the cloth bundle.
Watching her, Giles's beady eyes began to dart around in sudden panic. He sensed that something was going horribly wrong. Bound to the post, Bram struggled to lift his head and look at her. His bloodshot eyes sent a desperate, pleading signal. It was an urgent warning that if she revealed it, she would be in grave danger too. But Elara deliberately turned away from her husband's gaze. If she backed down now, they were both as good as dead. She pulled the dark, silver-inlaid oak casket from the cloth and set it down on the damp earth. Catching the pale winter sunlight, the iron keyhole of the casket flashed sharply, piercing the sheriff's eyes. The noisy, chaotic air of the courtyard instantly sank, becoming as heavy as lead. Sensing this was no ordinary stolen good, the crowd held its breath. The sheriff's expression stiffened strangely. Was this lord truly a man of justice, or was he in league with that vile spy? If the sheriff was part of their ring, this casket would not be a lifeline, but the very executioner's axe that would sever both their heads. "My lord, that is the stolen cargo the wench made off with. We must seize it at once." Giles yelled, his eyes bulging as he lunged forward. Elara stepped back from his sudden aggression, but she refused to let go of the casket in her arms. As the guards closed in, leveling their spears to surround her, she glared straight at the sheriff with eyes full of venom and shouted, "Anyone who lays a hand on this casket will hang for high treason against the crown." At that freezing, authoritative declaration, Giles froze in his tracks. Even the gawking villagers in the yard went dead silent. Elara's voice was trembling, but her eyes were no longer those of a lowly peasant maid. "Whether this contains the honor my lord has lost, or the king's secret signet that a man sworn to the crown dare not covet, open it and see for yourself." The sheriff's brow twitched violently. How dare she spew such insolence in his own courtyard? Yet, overwhelmed by her fierce, unyielding presence, the sheriff could not simply order her tied to the post. Instead, he was swallowed by a strange mix of morbid curiosity and creeping dread. The watching crowd began to murmur, "Even for a criminal, isn't this too much?" The whispers spread like ripples in a pond. Bound to the whipping post, witnessing his wife being threatened and trampled upon right before his eyes, Bram's absolute control finally snapped. Letting out a roar like a wounded bear, he thrashed so violently that the thick hemp ropes dug deep into his flesh, drawing fresh crimson blood. The ropes, pulled taut to the point of snapping, manifested his sheer, unadulterated fury. "Enough! Do you intend to turn my court into a madhouse?" the sheriff roared, slamming his fist down on the oak table. At that thunderous shout, Giles stopped his aggressive advance. From the muddy pit of the yard, Elara slowly raised her head. Through her disheveled, tangled hair, her eyes gleamed not with fear,
but with a terrifying, venomous defiance. She roughly wiped the bright red blood trickling from her lip with the back of her hand.
Then, with trembling hands, she hoisted the casket high toward the sheriff. "You may kill me, but you must open this casket yourself, my lord. See for yourself if it holds a smuggler's loot or the property of the crown." At the sheriff's subtle nod, a deputy marched over and snatched the casket from her grasp. Left empty-handed, Elara collapsed onto the dirt, but the fire in her eyes remained fiercely alive. With a heavy, solid thud, the oak casket was placed on the sheriff's great oak table. A silence so heavy you could hear a man swallow his dry spit crushed the courtyard. Every single eye was fixed on the sheriff's fingertips. Elara turned her head to look at her bloodied husband. In their intertwined gaze, a heartbreaking, desperate comfort passed between them. The die was cast. If the contents inside that casket had been swapped, it would be the end of everything. The sheriff, with an irritated scoff, roughly threw back the lid of the oak casket. With a sharp click, the tightly sealed lid opened, revealing a royal writ of charter and a dark wax seal resting on a bed of rich crimson velvet. The sheriff carelessly reached out to pick up the item, but suddenly his hands began to shake so violently he nearly dropped it. As the midday sun struck the heavy golden seal, the intricate engraving of the king's majestic lions flashed with a brilliant golden light, illuminating the entire courtyard. The manor steward, standing beside him, hurriedly brought over a ledger of royal crests to compare the design. Looking up at the sheriff with a face utterly drained of blood, the steward shook his head. It was no forgery. This is... The sheriff could not finish his sentence. He shot up from his grand chair as if struck by lightning. It was then. Bound to the whipping post, Bram slowly raised his head. The voice that erupted from between his cracked and bleeding lips was no longer that of a cowering criminal. A thunderous roar shook the very foundations of the castle keep. Have you looked inside the casket? What you hold in your trembling hands is my true authority. The moment the sheriff let out a pathetic shriek and collapsed backward onto the floor, Bram surged upward, letting out a massive battle cry as if he were about to snap the thick hemp ropes with his bare strength. The king's royal justiciar has arrived. His mighty shout echoed over the stone walls and reached the very edges of the muddy market square. The heavy iron gates of the courtyard were smashed open as the king's hidden men, clad in royal armor, stormed the grounds. "Make way for the crown's royal legate! Corrupt lords and greedy dogs, to your knees!" Amidst the earth-shattering battle cries, Bram pulled a red cord from his tunic, raising high the heavy golden seal of the king. The brilliant morning sunlight struck the royal crest, illuminating the majestic lions forged in pure gold. The sheriff, who had been standing upon the raised wooden dais, tumbled downward as if his legs had turned to water. Groveling flat against the cold mud of the courtyard. Giles, who had been so arrogant just moments before, collapsed entirely, his knees failing him as he scrambled backward in sheer terror. The murmuring crowd of commoners parted like the sea, dropping to their knees in the muddy market square and bowing their heads to the earth. The atmosphere in the manor courtyard reversed in an instant, and a chill wind swept through the silent space.
Bram walked past the groveling sheriff and went straight to Elara. He wrapped his strong arms around her trembling shoulders and gently brushed the dark soot and dirt from her worn wool dress.
This woman is my lawful wedded wife and a loyal servant of the crown who risked her life to protect the king's decree,
Bram declared, his voice echoing off the cold stone church.
Who dares call her lowborn now? The golden seal caught the sunlight, blinding in its authority.
There was nowhere left for their enemies to run, leaving only the pathetic trembling of guilty men.
With a deafening thud, the heavy iron gates of the sheriff's court were slammed shut. Escape was impossible.
Over a blazing hearth fire in the center of the yard, red wax was melted down in an iron pot. Bram took the lord's seat at the high table, pressing the heavy royal seal onto the seized shipping ledgers and salt manifests. The sizzling sound of burning parchment and the sharp smell of hot wax filled the air as the red clumps sealed the documents. It was the undeniable mark of judgment that would sever the lifelines of the corrupt.
Bound tightly to the wooden pillory, Giles screamed in agony. With every strike of the lash tearing into his back, he desperately spilled his secrets. The Duke. It was the Duke who ordered it all. At the mention of the powerful High Lord, the sheriff's hand shook like a leaf in the winter wind as he was forced to record the confession. Cold sweat dripped from his brow onto the parchment, blurring the dark ink. At that exact moment, the king's men raided the moored merchant cogs down by the river. Sharp halberds tore open rough sacks of cheap grain, revealing a cascade of smuggled foreign velvet, rare spices, and untaxed silver coins hidden within. The undeniable evidence of their boundless greed lay bare under the midday sun. Soon after, the royal guards marched upon the heavy oak doors of Margaret's grand estate. "Mercy, my lord, mercy!" Margaret and her steward were stripped of their aristocratic privileges by the king's men, screaming as they were placed under royal arrest in their ruined linen gowns. Confined securely to be transported to the king's court for formal trial, their ruin and wretchedness was absolute. Watching from afar, Elara felt hot tears well up in her eyes. The heavy burden of 10 years of servitude and the profound catharsis of seeing justice served washed over her. Yet she also felt a strange emptiness at how pathetic her former tormentors truly were. Bram stood before the mountain of confiscated wealth in the courtyard and issued a stern command. Return all this stolen grain and silver to the starving commoners of the market. The very people of the market square who had spat on him just yesterday, calling him a beast and an outlaw, now wept openly, pressing their foreheads into the cold mud. "We were blind. We did not recognize a true servant of the king," they wailed in deep remorse. Looking down at the guilt-ridden peasants, Bram spoke in a low, resonant voice. The law exists to shield the people. The crime of bleeding the innocent for private greed is a heavy one. His justice was not cruel, but it was absolute and unyielding. Those who had slandered Elara and spread vicious tavern gossip were forced to kneel in the mud and read public declarations of their own guilt. Broken wooden staffs of the corrupt manor guards rolled across the cobblestones, signaling the total collapse of the local tyranny. By dusk, The courtyard of the sheriff's court was entirely empty. The king's men washed the bloodstains from the stone floors with buckets of cold water. Lumps of discarded red wax flowed into the gutters along with the crimson water. This swift and absolute judgment would shake the entire kingdom to its core. Once the chaos subsided and a deep quiet returned, Bram and Elara sat side by side on the wooden bench near the hearth fire of their timber cottage, silently looking out over the empty yard. Elara's hands, as she poured cold water from a pitcher, still bore the dark blue bruises and the harsh signs of winter frostbite. Yet those scars were no longer the brand of a lowborn maid. They were the glorious medals of a woman who had dragged herself through the mud and defied death to protect the man she loved. Without a word, Bram reached into his heavy woolen cloak and pulled out a small cloth bundle. From it, he retrieved a beautifully crafted silver cloak brooch. With rough, calloused, but incredibly gentle hands, he drew Elara's worn collar together and pinned the brooch into place. The moment the cold silver touched her skin, Elara's eyes flushed red with emotion. "You have suffered," Bram said, his gruff voice trembling with a deep, hidden tenderness. "I will spend the rest of my life repaying this debt." His words resonated deep within her heart. Over the timber fence, the noise of the muddy market square could still be heard. But there was no longer any mockery or scorn in those distant voices. The gazes that peeked through the gaps in the wood were filled only with awe, respect, and a healthy fear. Elara quietly swept away the broken pieces of a clay mug from the night before and filled a fresh wooden cup with steaming herbal tea. The world rarely returns what it steals, but that which is defended with one's very life remains fiercely warm. In the corner of their yard, at the tip of a barren hawthorn branch that seemed dead to the world, a single tiny white bud had formed. At the bitter edge of the bone-chilling winter wind, the faint but undeniable breath of spring had finally arrived. People only truly harden through their scars, and they find their salvation through unwavering faith in one another. Truth, no matter how delayed, always arrives at its destination. But paving the road for its arrival is always the burden of courageous souls. The silver brooch on Elara's cloak caught the late afternoon sunlight, gleaming brilliantly. That pure, radiant light was driving away the last remnants of the pitch-black darkness from the night before. True peace is never freely given. It is a profound grace earned only by those willing to bleed to protect it.